A relationship with the right referral partner could be a game changer for any B2B company. So, what if you could reverse engineer these relationships at a moment's notice? Start a podcast, invite potential referral partners to be guests on your show, and grow your referral network faster than ever. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show. I'm your host for today's episode, Logan Lyles, Director of Partnerships here at Sweetfish. I am joined today by Emly Lonetto. She is part of the growth team at Clio. Emly, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Logan?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for joining me today. We've had this on the calendar multiple times, but I'm really excited to share your expertise with the audience, and I'm glad we finally connected.
I'm excited.
Well, Emly, we're going to be diving into really defining growth and taking a closer look at it. It's something that you've been talking to your team internally about, and I know you've done some keynotes on this topic when James and you were, I think, together at a dinner or something a few months back. He said, we've got to get Emly on B2B Growth and share her perspective with our listeners. So really excited to dive in and pick apart what growth is and what it isn't today for our listeners. Before we do that, I'd love for you to share a little bit about your background and what you and the Clio team are up to these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Emly, and I've been in growth for a couple of years now. Actually kind of feel like most people who started in growth kind of fell into it, as they all say. Started off working on the growth team at Tilt, which was a Y Combinator company based in San Francisco, working on the growth team here out in Toronto, trying to figure out how can we make payments as easy as possible for college and university students. We essentially were the Canadian Venmo for a while and got to really kind of see what does a startup really need to kind of grow from practically nothing out here internationally into basically a verb out on campus. So that's kind of what got me hooked, at least in terms of growth. And then following Tilt, I ended up actually starting the growth team over at GrowSumo, which is now called PartnerStack, also a Y Combinator company. They're trying to figure out how can we actually take some of the stuff that I learned back at Tilt, which really was revolved around trying to automate partnerships and growing through those, and bring that into more of a B2B scale. So GrowSumo and PartnerStack now help automate partnership channels for companies like Asana, Intuit, Drift, things like that. And now I'm over at Clio, where our growth team, relatively new, super cool to be able to work on trying to figure out how can we grow Clio, which has been around for 10 years, and now take that into that next step of our growth journey. And what Clio does is we're a legal tech company. And what we do is we make everything easy from client intake to client invoice, and help automate that and put that into the cloud for law firms. So we have a lawyer CRM and also a practice management system. So yeah, it's really, really cool. Our growth team's been able to work on so many different arms. I run experimental growth there. We have someone who's focused on international growth, mid-market, vertical. It's crazy. Doing so many different things.
Yeah, nice. Well, let's dive into, this definition of growth and, what it really is. So I think you'd like to start off with talking about what growth isn't and some common misconceptions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess one of the big things that kind of keeps me interested in growth right now is the fact that growth is super important to every company, as we all know. But it's now becoming more and more of a necessity for people to really kind of hone what are the different ways that people can grow at different stages, using different levers and being a little bit craftier with the way that you're kind of figuring out what that strategy is. And one thing that I really love about it is that it is so different. It's super different from every company that I've been at. It's every person that I've spoken to. Every company has a different way of growing. But some of the common misconceptions about that is when you, let's say, sit down one day and say, I'm interested in growth, or I want to hire a growth marketer, I want to hire a product growth person, all of those terms have now kind of fallen into a couple different buckets where people now are referencing the same type of case studies or trying to replicate different things, or often think of growth as a growth hack instead of a growth strategy. And really, that's something that I spend a lot of my time at work, but also outside of work, trying to focus on and figure out how can we train better people or get better resources so that people can understand the differences in between a growth hack or something that's actually going to grow that company long term. Some of the biggest, I guess, miscommunications around growth is that growth is something that's a little hacky, that it's going to equal instant gratification and flurry of new users, something along the lines of the stuff that people reference, like Dropbox's referral program that skyrocketed them, or Airbnb when they first leveraged Craigslist, things like that. And while those are great examples of something that they tried, it was an experiment for that company, doesn't define what growth is. And it's not going to be replicable for every other company. And definitely not something that I personally could use, at least at work. And I think where a lot of that stems from as well is that times are really changing around growth. Maybe even like referencing like 5 years ago, people were all chasing after 5-10 years ago, people were all chasing after those early adopters, innovators, the people that were super excited about tech, that you were so focused on user growth that that's all that people were talking about. Like X company just got 10,000 new users or blew up with like 1 million signups in like 3 months or something like that, or thinking about like those HQ examples, things like that. But the difference now is that growth isn't just about competing for those early adopters and the easy come, easy go signups. It's really about trying to figure out now, how do you retain those users? Not how do you get your first 10,000 users, but how do you keep them? And constantly trying to battle that or build the product or find ways that you can build levers that kind of do both of those or care about. And that's really what I'm focused on now.
Yeah. So in your mind, Emily, does growth go much deeper than just, that awareness and activation to the other stages in the funnel?
Oh, absolutely. I think that a lot of people think that growth is like a really easy way to tap into that top of funnel, to drive leads or to just immediately try to kind of boost views or whatever that initial kind of interaction is. But the truth is that that is perhaps maybe one way, or maybe that's one problem that you're trying to solve at that moment. But that builds into so many other parts of the funnel. And like the funnel that most growth marketers or people in growth in general use is the pirate metric, the R one, where it goes awareness, acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, referral. But the thing is that all of those things are interconnected. And the difference between someone who is just trying to build awareness versus someone who's actually thinking like long-term growth strategy is you have to figure out, in a lot of ways, are you building, I call them kind of traps in some ways. Maybe that's one way of doing it. I think a lot of people talk about lead magnets on the top. I talk about kind of traps on that in between. But basically what I like to do is focus on, if I want to tap into awareness, it's great to do that just kind of on its own, but it's even better if you have that trap, if you have something that is actually going to carry that campaign that you're focused on throughout the product, or kind of that next step or third step. So like an example of that being is back when we launched send and request money with Tilt, for instance. So Tilt, for those of you who are unfamiliar, it was an easy way to send, request, or split money between friends. And what we did kind of 2 years in, when I was there at least, we launched send and request, which was P2P money transfers. And ultimately, like, our goal was obviously we wanted more people to download the app, but more importantly, we wanted more people to actually use the app and actually use that new feature. So the campaign that we launched with that, instead of just leading, let's say, typically to ad and then a download tilt page, it went from ad to a page that was called daveistheworst.com, which wasn't even tilt.com, but instead spoke about exactly what our product was trying to solve, which was those unsexy reasons that people would use Tilt. They had understood what we were doing, but also got them to use it. So, for example, Tilt was really well known in the past for these massive parties or crazy big events that were great in the States. So like Cinco de Mayo parties, frat parties, things like that. But the frequency of those are relatively small in comparison to how often you pay your bills or you pay a friend back or things like that. So we wanted to, number one, explain that Tilt could be used more frequently and for those non-sexy but pretty crucial things, because those equal growth. Number two, we wanted to actually get people to try it out so they could see that product experience kind of coupled with it. So with this campaign, people hit daveistheworst.com, hit multiple different scenarios where it was like, Dave never pays for his share of the food, but he's always eating. Simple CTA, make Dave pay. And when someone did that, they were able to, number one, relate, because that's a very reasonable roommate debacle. But number two, they would download that app, look up Dave, and actually request money from him, and the app would pay it out. And the difference there was it's not just me telling people, okay, this is why you should care, this is what we're all about. It actually got them involved in that process and completed that narrative deeper in that funnel, got them to use the product, set up all the other triggers, and actually kind of married that campaign as a whole. And kind of the coolest part about that as well is that if people didn't put in their bank information, which was actually the bottleneck or the hardest part of our app, the app's triggers all took care of that already. And if they never did it in the end, that money would bounce back. So it actually became a really cost-effective way of marketing and also growing that product with active users.
Today's growth story is about Lilliard Insurance Agency. The biggest challenge for one of their B2B sales agents was finding contact information for businesses that fit his target profile. He was running out of time to meet his monthly sales goal, so he turned to simple internet searches. Too often, the information he found was old and unreliable. He was spending too much valuable selling time looking for email addresses and phone numbers that turned out to be inaccurate and unusable anyway. The rep, Sam Hoover, heard about Sales Genie from his manager, and that's when everything changed. Sam started using Sales Genie's powerful database access to build targeted lists and get the contact information he needed to work new leads. He was able to profile his best customers to find prospects that looked just like them. He even used Sales Genie to find ways to reach them with direct mail, email, and online marketing campaigns. Sam immediately increased his monthly sales production by 200%. Can Sales Genie help you drive similar sales results? Probably. Head over to salesgenie.com/B2B to get a demo and a free customer analysis. All right, let's get back into the show. I love that. So one of the things you touched on too, Emily, as we were chatting offline before we hit record was, this idea that growth isn't as new as people think it is, and really building experiences, which you touched on in this example here. Tell me a little bit about, maybe the misconception about what's actually new, what companies have been doing well to build experiences as it relates to overall growth and not necessarily just a hack or the common misconceptions of what growth is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that one of the coolest things about growth is when it comes to SaaS, a lot of people think that growth equals user growth. It's how many people can they drive to this page, new users, that kind of stint. But while it's not always about user growth, it is always about the user. And I think one thing that really comes from that is it's really about understanding what that user is trying to accomplish at that exact moment in the journey that you have, and trying to craft experiences that really help map their existing behaviors to what your product is going to be able to enhance for them, or try to kind of marry those two so it becomes really natural. And one of the things that I think is really cool about growth when I actually think, or when I'm referencing this with people who are brand new to kind of the idea of what growth is I think that there's actually a lot of different companies outside of SaaS or outside of your typical type of tech company that have been doing really cool things with growth as well. Or maybe even there's times like, for instance, I'm in B2B growth, but there are definitely times where I lean on e-commerce companies or B2C experiences to try to figure out what are the similarities, what can I take away from that. So some examples that I typically lean on, at least in my presentation that I do, is like, for instance, you have Abercrombie and Fitch, for example. Abercrombie and Fitch, as you guys know, used to be, maybe is still, I'm not sure, a majorly popular clothing brand. One of the things that they used to do, maybe about like a decade ago, or maybe a little less than that, was they actually used to have live models outside of their stores. So when you would pass by, I'm sure you guys have seen it before, tons of shirtless men or women that are beautiful, not shirtless, beautiful, outside of their locations to try to get people to, number one, pay attention to them, but also associate that with their brand. And what was kind of brilliant about that, other than the fact that it's obviously a marketing campaign, was that it got people to associate that experience where people were no longer just going to go in, buy a t-shirt and leave, but there were, let's say, people that were actually going to plan out, okay, like I want to go and I want to take a photo with these people. This is part of that experience, the Abercrombie and Fitch experience. And when they walk in and they buy something and they leave, that took that a little piece of that experience back with them. And that's like not necessarily what you would think as a scalable, very software oriented like growth spiel. But one thing that actually did accomplish was it married that brand with an experience that lasted, and people still think about those things. And while it didn't last long term, there are companies that can kind of do similar things to that, where now you have examples of companies that are now taking, okay, what's that first experience, and now trying to productize that. So like take an example of like Glossier, for instance. It's a crazy successful online beauty brand that a lot of women, including myself, are absolutely love their products. And to be quite honest, like if you talk to most of us have never actually been in a physical Glossier store. And that's really rare when you think about how most of us create or most of us purchase our beauty products in the past. And one thing that they did was, and it's actually quite similar to kind of the Abercrombie and Fitch first experience, is that they send this beautifully curated box, and that box is actually their first experience. And they have people that are totally focused on that to make it irresistible to people to actually want to keep that, to take each one of the items out and carefully understand how they all work together. That is actually quite similar to even onboarding or things that we look for in that first experience when we first dive into a product as well.
I love it. Let's go from here, Emily, to, a lot of listeners of our show are marketers that don't have growth in their title. So what is your advice for people in the organization that don't have growth in their title and applying these concepts, applying these definitions, these examples of growth throughout the funnel in ways that they can help build their brand and drive more growth for their organization?
So I think that honestly, most people that are actually doing growth out there, I feel like actually don't have growth in their title. Like it's not a common thing for someone to wake up one day and be like, I'm going to be in growth. Like I definitely never said that when I was in university. And I'm sure most people still don't understand that some of the stuff that they're doing actually does fall into this, or aren't fully certain where can you draw that line? Where can you actually take what you're doing maybe as a marketer and figure out how can you now build that a little deeper, or how can you work with different departments to maybe do a different type of campaign where you're focused on something else. And I think that one of the things to kind of take away from that is that it really isn't in the title. It's really all about the mindset. And while that sounds really cheesy, I think that where people can really start to think about growth, or where they can start to kind of dive further, is number one, like start with questions. Like try to figure out, like I personally have like a list of Post-it notes that are like my gut check questions, because everyone has their own biases. And even myself, I definitely need to get in a room every now and again and be like, okay, is this something that will drive, let's say, X metric that I care about? Or is there something that I can do that will make this hit other metrics as well? Like, how can I
Yeah.
make this even of a bigger impact?
So, what are some specific examples of those gut check questions? I'd love to hear what's on some of those post-it notes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think like me personally, one of the things that I really care about obviously is, well, MQLs or things like that. So that aside, some of the other things that I like to check when it comes to actually running an experiment is number one, like, is this a manual solution? So is this something that right now will require someone physically to kind of do this? If not, can this be automated in the future? Because I think that automation piece really is something that kind of takes a campaign and turns it into a growth lever. Because ultimately, what you're trying to do is test out things. Is this making an impact? Is this driving the hypothesis that you first thought? And if it does, can you scale that? Or is this something that's just going to be more a short term thing? Because growth isn't just about that short term, it's also about that long term. And I also find that some marketing campaigns that people do can actually fall into this bucket where maybe the whole thing can't be replicable as an automated thing, but maybe aspects of it can, which can help you fire those up more and more frequently or attack different audiences and continue to drive that as another lever or channel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think other ones as well are, can this experiment or project impact multiple areas of the company? And that will really help you think about what is the absolute most that it can impact. And then lastly, what's the difficulty or priority of this project or experiment? Because I think that a lot of times people fall into, I know I do this all the time, where prioritization is actually my hardest challenge all the time.
Yeah.
When I'm super excited about growing something, I have like 100 thousands of different ideas, like different stuff that I constantly want to do, but not all of them are going to make the greatest impact with the least amount of time. And what I often try to do as well, and this is something that I think that any marketer can do as well, is take all those initiatives, take all those ideas and plot those out and try to figure out, are these things that you can do on your own? Is this some that you might need a little resources after? Or the third bucket there is always, is this something that if I sit down on a weekend and I can learn something, will this help me be able to do these types of experiments more frequently and more on my own, empower yourself to grow more?
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are great questions to ask yourself as you're trying to prioritize. I don't think you're alone in prioritization being one of the biggest struggles that we all have these days. I know I feel that a lot. Awesome. Well, Emily, I love those strategies. Any additional, resources, books, anything else on this topic of growth that you would like to point people to that you've found that have, helped you kind of grow in your growth role over multiple companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually I'm a huge supporter of any kind of like user research blogs or going after anything that is more in that user psych realm, because I actually believe that as much as the tools and the opportunities that we have will change, I personally think, and this is a little bleak, but I think people don't actually change that much. So trying to kind of dive into any user psych blogs or kind of research is always good. I personally reference a website called Coglode all the time. It's www.coglode. And what they do is they take these massive user psych studies and they actually turn them into like 1 to 2 minute readable nuggets. And I find that's a really good way of trying to figure out, okay, can you embed some of these theories into some of the stuff that you're testing? And I think other things as well is I regularly go on Medium and I'm constantly reading a bunch of different publications that I see that some people are kind of going through. So the Startup Grind is a good one. I also go to Reforge a lot, which I would definitely recommend reading their blog.
I love it. Emily, this has been a really great conversation. I love that you're kind of peeling back the onion on growth a little bit and showing that, it's not all about growth hacking, which I think for a lot of folks is what they think about when they think about growth, and some things that, marketers and folks in all sorts of roles without growth in their title can be thinking about to incorporate, solid growth methodologies in their long-term strategies, not just in short-term hacks and things like that. If anybody listening to this, Emily, would like to follow up with you, stay connected, reach out and ask another question or something like that, what's the best way for them to go about doing that?
Absolutely. Definitely look me up on LinkedIn. just Emly Lonetto. And I also have Twitter. I barely use it, but I'm trying to. So by all means, harass me there. And that's just Emly Lonetto as well. So definitely feel free to reach out on either one of those, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Well, Emily, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for sharing with our listeners today.
Awesome.
Digital marketing agencies have a tough job. You have to stay on top of the latest marketing strategies for your clients and your agency. What if there was a way you could address both at the same time? Imagine your agency putting out content with greater quality and quantity. Envision bringing your clients a turnkey solution for one of B2B marketing's fastest growing media strategies, podcasting. You know, all those clients asking for your help with their account-based marketing efforts? Picture being the first to bring them the idea of content-based networking, showing them the proven strategy for breaking into their most coveted accounts. Here's the concept. Sweetfish Media is looking to work with a limited number of innovative agencies interested in a new partnership model. We produce a podcast for your agency. You introduce the power of podcasting and Sweetfish services to your clients. Everybody wins. Learn more at sweetfishpartners.com.